Championship college football preview show presented by the Sportscast. Today's date is January 5th, 2021. If you haven't yet, please subscribe in all your channels on YouTube, Twitter, twitch.tv, and Apple Podcasts. If you are on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It does help us out tremendously. You can also visit us on the sportscast.net and also follow us on Twitter at the Sportscast1 and check out our app, the Sportscast, in the iOS App Store. I'm joined today by Chris Caravello, as you guys probably know from the last time we were on, a writer for the West Coast College Football and co-host of the Southern Gentleman Sports Show on the Ticket 8:50 a.m. in Pensacola, Florida. Chris, quick agenda for today. Just going to be going over the playoff games in Dallas and Miami, talking about the two blowouts that we witnessed. One of them I got to see in person, and then discussing our national championship matchup, our all-SEC national championship matchup, which I'm not sure if our listeners are happy or mad about that, but I'm sure we can get into it. I want to start with the early game, Alabama defeating Cincinnati 27-6. Just want to get your overall feelings about how the game played out and really based on your predictions, what kind of matched up with how you thought it was going to go and what was different, what surprised you about the result?
Deep down inside, I can't really say I was surprised by the result or the margin of victory. On the preview show, I think that we all wanted Cincinnati to have a good showing. The first time a group of five team had made it this far to the playoff. But, as the game went on, it just was it was apparent that the mismatch was going to be way too much for Cincinnati to overcome. I think Brian Robinson, obviously being at 100% health, really just made Alabama sucked the life out of the Bearcats. And I saw a lot on Twitter that this game was being compared to when Washington played Alabama, just because of how, I guess, maybe the first quarter unfolded. I don't see it that way. In that game in 2016, Jalen Hurts was erratic. The defense for Washington chased him all over the field. Cincinnati did nothing of the sort to Bryce Young. He was a steady, efficient game. I mentioned Robinson's stats. It was like a bored boa constrictor taking its time, eating its meal.
Yeah, and those are all really great points. And I just want to lay the foundation and say this. Cincinnati deserved to be there. They really did, based on, in my opinion, the strength of schedule that they had, going undefeated. And there are a lot of people that saw the end result and said, see, I told you, that's why a group of five team should never be in it. And I could not disagree with that more. With that being said, in my opinion, from what I've seen, the biggest difference going from a Power 5 team to a group of five team is the line of scrimmage. And particularly Alabama's offensive line just pushed Cincinnati around all day. You mentioned Brian Robinson, averaged well over 7 yards a carry, I think, over 204 yards. I know Alabama rushed for over 300 yards, which was more than Cincinnati as a team totaled. That's never a recipe for success. I also think that there are a lot of Alabama fans that maybe are saying a little bit disappointed in the overall play. I think from a game plan perspective, very early on, Alabama realized not only can they move the ball, but they were gonna win this game. Particularly in that middle first quarter after Cincinnati's first drive, which was obviously very telegraphed and very successful for them. And obviously they had that chance. I don't know if you saw the play where Kool-Aid McKinstry actually got burned by Alec Pierce, and then that ball got tipped down at the line. That's a touchdown, 9 times out of 10. With all that being said, I'm curious to see what your thoughts are from Alabama's defensive performance. I've seen a steady improvement from some of their, erratic play in the middle part of the season, especially. So talk a little bit about how Alabama's defense played and what your expectations were for them going into, against the game with a really good offense, I think.
Yeah. And the playmakers for Cincinnati, obviously had a very different game than what we've been accustomed to seeing out of Ritter and some of those other offensive playmakers for the Bearcats. It just wasn't there against Alabama. They really rose to the occasion, especially the secondary, and there was just nothing there. The lopsided, as the game progressed and the disparity in the yardage just grew and grew and grew. It must have been a very frustrating day for a Cincinnati fan to just watch that offense sputter. I mean, it was a very dominant performance by the Tide, one of the best of the year.
Yeah, and to that point, I want to flip to the other side of the ball for Alabama and talk specifically about Bryce Young. You mentioned he played efficient, which he did, right? 3 touchdown passes as well. I think that goes kind of under the radar. That's all 3 of Alabama's touchdowns in the game were through the air, but only 180 yards or so. I think that was his lowest yard or second lowest yards total for any game throughout this season. Talk a little bit about his play. What did you see? And just talk a little bit about how Bryce Young overall in your eyes played.
Yeah, he just took what the defense gave him, kind of lulled you to sleep until, bam, that 44-yarder to Ja'Cory Brooks. In my opinion, that put the game out of reach. That was over as soon as that pass left his hand. Didn't have to do much with Robinson doing most of the damage for Alabama's offense. But, when they got down there, the touchdown to Latu, I think those are the plays that Young took advantage of. He did what he had to. Didn't make any mistakes, which that had been his success story all year long.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And the efficiency standpoint, I think, as well, just goes into the game planning from Bill O'Brien. Again, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Run, number 4 and Trey Sanders and run that clock and get out of there. I'm curious. I've been reading a little bit about, from an offensive standpoint, maybe trying to not show Georgia too much, kind of knowing early on that the game was in hand and keeping it very vanilla, in terms of the route running and those types of things. Again, want to say that with all credit being done to Cincinnati's secondary, which Jamison Williams didn't really have that big of a game, as some were expecting. Ja'Cory Brooks, that I think both of those guys had like 60 yards total, maybe 5 or 6 catches, but nothing crazy like we've seen from Jamison Williams throughout the year. Talk a little bit about that mentality, like from Bill O'Brien's standpoint, when you're going to win and you feel like the game is in hand and not trying to show your next opponent too much.
Yeah, and that might sound cliche to some, but when you have that much of a, that definitive feeling that you're going to win this game, and not wanting to play your hand. But at the same time, this offense is not the same offense that rolled into the SEC championship game. Robinson wasn't at 100% in that game. He obviously is now. So I think they can do more than what they showed last month in Atlanta. And Georgia's got to be wary of that.
Yeah, and I feel like, we haven't touched on Cincinnati too much. Let's talk about Desmond Ritter for a little bit. Again, not his best performance. Didn't turn the ball over, but I think had about 150 yards or so, about a 50% completion percentage. Talk a little bit about how he played, and really what do you think his ceiling is, maybe at the next level? Where do you think he gets picked in the NFL draft?
It'll be interesting to see where he falls in the draft. We said before that game that he needed to do things with his legs. That really didn't happen for him. He looked very indecisive in some of those moments later in the game when they were trying to come back. It just didn't look like the same quarterback, that we've seen the last couple of years for Cincinnati and some of these dominant performances. And that is solely just due to the defense that he was facing in Alabama. I mean, I think he played about as well as could be expected. Didn't turn the ball over, but then again, he didn't have those otherworldly performances that would have been necessary for Cincinnati to have a shot in this game.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think I saw on Mel Kiper's big board, he actually has Desmond Ritter as his second quarterback coming off the board behind Kenny Pickett. I think that's really interesting. So we'll see where that comes, where that he ultimately lands, day 2, day 3 pick or whatever that may be. But to your point, when you have Will Anderson and Dallas Turner basically breathing down your neck as soon as you snap the ball, really, what are your expectations going to be? And really, it reminded me kind of Cook's performance when they played Michigan State a couple of years ago. Just looked lost. Really confused, and a lot of the things, the systems, they had 2 successful drives and they were both scripted. That first drive in the first half and the first drive in the second half, both coming up with points. And then from there, it was a lot of 3 and outs. Want to talk a little bit about something that I think is going to be a precursor to what we discuss here in just a little bit, and that is the injuries from Alabama's side of things, particularly on the offensive line. The right guard, Emil Ekiyor, left and did not return. And also towards the tail end of the game, the right tackle, Chris Owens, goes down and had to be helped off the field, did not return. Talk a little bit about how big of a concern that is, given how shaky Alabama's offensive line has played throughout the year. And what does that look like, facing Georgia here coming up on Monday?
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, that unit didn't allow a sack in the SEC championship game, the only game this year that Georgia did not record a sack. So those 2 guys getting banged up, man, that could really swing things in the Bulldogs' favor. They've got to hope that those guys get healthy. I think the Saban said what the status is. I know he's been kind of coy on the injuries, but yeah, you really want to see those guys at least, as close to full strength as possible going up against a defense like Georgia.
Yeah, and I've heard Saban basically say he hopes to have them back, which again, it's that's not really what you want to hear, right? Especially for the last game of the season and for that right side, which has been, kind of a thorn in the offense's side the whole year. And also another point from an injury perspective is Jalen Armour-Davis, who did start the game. But I think, what wasn't playing up to the expectations, or at least the limitations from his injury, forcing them to play Kyrie Jackson opposite of Kool-Aid McKinstry. I thought he played well. I know he was, the number 1 JUCO transfer coming out a couple of years ago, but really hasn't played much since then. But again, that's going up against, no offense, a much smaller competition than what he's going to see against Georgia. So really interested to see, what that from a health perspective looks like for Alabama on Monday, especially because those guys didn't return. It's one thing to have, a slight tweak or something, and they come back, after a couple of series, but they, Chris Owens had to be helped off the field. That's never a good sign, especially that right tackle spot. So any last thoughts before we move on to the night game?
Yeah, well, I mean, like we mentioned, the talent disparity on the lines really is what, and I think that's going to be what stands out if this happens again, or if they expand the playoff and more group of 5 teams get into this thing. That's when you're really going to see it jump off the paper at you and see. And no offense to, like you said, to Cincinnati, I wouldn't have thought any other team deserved to be there besides them. They were clearly one of the 4 best teams throughout and they deserve their shot. People want to make the argument for maybe Ohio State or some of the other teams that came on hot. Can't do that. It's a full season, and Cincinnati showed they belong there.
Yeah, and I was actually talking to a couple of Cincinnati fans after the game, and they were talking about them going to the Big 12, I believe, right? So they'll get a chance, right, to not only benefit from joining a Power 5 conference and the monetary perspective that goes into additional facilities and recruiting and all that stuff. So, who knows? Maybe we'll see them again sometime in the future. And again, hats off to that team and the success they had. But want to shift our focus here a little bit in this conversation, talking about the late night game, Georgia and Michigan. Again, another blowout. Georgia 34, Michigan 11. Chris, tell us a little bit about, again, your thoughts initially on this game, what your expectations were versus what actually happened, and really, if anything, what surprised you the most?
Wow, boy, did I get fooled on this one. I thought this was finally going to be a competitive semifinal matchup. I said it was going to be the best one that we had seen since the playoffs began. Instead, it was just blowout city like all the other ones have been. I mean, from the first drive, I really was taken aback at how easily Georgia moved the ball down against Michigan. It was the Brock Bowers show early and often. They had no answer for him defensively. And Stetson Bennett, I will never doubt that kid again. That's another whiff on my part. He really played efficiently. Did a lot with his legs when he had to extend the play. Kicked it up into a gear that I didn't think he had. So I really was taken aback at how easily Georgia just dispatched Michigan right from the get-go. And what a bounce back performance. A few weeks after getting blown out, all the questions, ghosts come out of you can't beat Alabama. Is Stetson Bennett really the right quarterback? Is Kirby making another, bad second guess at who he names as a starter? I really think this team just rose up to the occasion and silenced a lot of questions.
Yeah, and you touched on a lot of really great points there on why Georgia was so successful. I want to talk a little bit about the other side of the coin. And I think a lot of Michigan fans are frustrated, and that comes from the Jim Harbaugh side of things of not being willing to adjust. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from this game is it seemed like Michigan said, well, we've been doing one thing really, really well all season long, which is run the ball. And, even though we're going up against the team that stops the run really well, we're not going to try anything different. We're not going to deviate from the plan that's been working. And it just didn't. In those first two series, it was clear that this wasn't going to work. And they just stuck with it. And by the time they tried to make some in-game adjustments, it was already, 27-0, 27-3, and too late at that point. So talk a little bit about the frustration from I'm curious to hear your opinion from the Michigan side of things. Again, not taking anything away from their season, beating Ohio State, finally getting over that cliff. And I think that obviously, Jim Harbaugh has a lot to learn from this experience. That's only going to lead to a more competitive Big Ten moving forward. But talk a little bit about, how Michigan played.
Yeah, it wasn't pretty until it was too little too late. Whether that was making the switch at quarterback from McNamara, I'm not sure that would have made any difference at all, but it was clear from the get-go that Corum and Haskins just weren't going to do much on the ground instead of Georgia defense. And they just kept trying. It was like, come hell or high water, we're going to stick to this formula. Hey, it beat Ohio State. Surely it can get us, some yardage against Georgia. And that just wasn't the case. They're very similarly built, but Georgia just has the better. Clear from the get-go that Michigan was kind of outclassed in this one. But that not to take away from what that team accomplished finally. I think Harbaugh, like you mentioned, he probably learned a lot from this experience. Clearly made some headway in the Big Ten against Ohio State. And you want to see it stay at that level. It should never be a decade or whatever it was, between victories over the Buckeyes. So you hope that Michigan as a program can build off this. Some of those players, can see what this team is capable of. But man, down in the Orange Bowl, that was a failed mission right there, right from the get-go.
Yeah, and I think too something I that was highlighted to me is just how much they lack in terms of skill positions, particularly at the wide receiver position. No team in America needs a guy like Jamison Williams on their offense more than Michigan, because that would open up so much more in terms of the potential that Josh Gaddis is running up there in Ann Arbor. So I think that from a recruiting perspective, or even, in the transfer portal, I hope, Jim Harbaugh takes this experience and says, we need to get faster. And we need some guys that can take the top off of defense. And I know they had that with Bell, who unfortunately, got injured early on in the season. And who knows, right. And who knows, what his impact would have been in a game like this, especially where, if you're going to an attack at a Georgia defense. I think the one thing that the SEC championship showed you is that their secondary is somewhat lacking in that perspective, and that's kind of who to go after. But with that being said, they did have 2 interceptions, and Kendrick had both of them. So from another thing I wanted to mention as well is just how well Georgia's offensive line played. I don't think Aiden Hutchinson, who, all reports are pointing to that he's going to be the number 1 overall pick in this year's draft. Did he even have a sack in the game? I don't think so. And the other guy, the guy on the other side too, who's projected to be, a very high pick, didn't have one either. So Georgia's offensive line play really, really impressed me. Another thing that I think shows the dynamics of Georgia's offense is James Cook. I really think that him having a successful game on the ground sets up everything that they want to do from an offensive perspective. If they can run the ball well, and again, I think we'll touch on this here in just a few minutes, that sets up Stetson Bennett where he doesn't have to do 3rd and longs. That one thing I started to notice is they hardly got 3rd down on any of their drives. It would be a 5-6 yard gain on 1st down, and then a second down, 1st down after that. I mean, it was very methodical what they were doing, and I think it sets them up for what Stetson Bennett does really well, which is the play action, which is the game manager. And once they got ahead, it's really just pour the gasoline on the fire and walk out with a big win. Talk a little bit about just how well that Georgia offensive looked, and really, I guess kind of leading into what our game prediction is going to be for the national championship. Is that something that they can continue to build off of?
Yeah. When you neutralize a guy like Aiden Hutchinson, I mean, that speaks volumes to how well Georgia's offensive line played. You took the words right out of my mouth about Cook. I mean, a lot different running back than his brother, who also had a monster Orange Bowl performance for Florida State back in the day. But the way that Georgia uses him in open space as a receiver, he was the leading receiver for Georgia in this game. And he's just really come on. He complements what the other running back, White, does so well as Bowers in the passing game. And then you saw it. You can't double both of these guys. Right when Michigan thinks they have a handle on Bowers and Cook, Jermaine Burton busts down the sideline for the dagger touchdown. So just a really all-out efficient performance from Georgia. And Stetson Bennett just was pulling the trigger at all the right times. So that really speaks well for how they're surging into the game on Monday. But now they got to do it against Alabama.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect transition point to talk about our national championship game in Indianapolis. This game is going to be on ESPN or ABC or ESPN. I'm not 100% sure, probably both. But in Indianapolis on Monday, 8:00 kickoff Eastern time. Right now, the Vegas line is Georgia -3 with the over-under set at 52 points. Chris, tell me a little bit about your initial thoughts on the rematch. Tell me a little bit about what your expectations are going to be going into this game. And really, and obviously, I think this is the main storyline here. What, if anything, could be different this time around?
Well, I mean, I'm going to try not to talk with my heart on this one because, as soon as you've seen all these things go wrong for Georgia year after year after year against the Crimson Tide, it's really hard not to just say, all right, here we go again. I was shocked that Georgia is the favorite, to be honest. I was in the casino checking out in Tahoe when I found out the line. I was surprised, and yeah, Georgia's been the best team in college football all year long. But it's very hard to discount what happened just a few weeks ago with how dominant that was. And Alabama's missing one of its key wide receivers going into this. They missed him for this game against Cincinnati. But we mentioned how great Robinson ended up looking. So that's a factor they didn't have when they played Georgia the first time that now the Bulldogs have to account for. When you think about what's gone wrong for Georgia in these games, the question that I don't have answered up to this point in the 2021 college football season is what happens to Georgia when they go down, when they're down 2 scores, when things aren't going right. We've only seen it happen once, and they lost big time. Not a lot to go off of, Nick, to be honest. So why would I expect anything to happen differently this time if Georgia slips up and falls behind in this game?
Yeah, that is such a great point. Something else I think was obviously evident in the last game, and no fault of their own for playing it like this, but I think Georgia fully believed they could get home, meaning pressuring Bryce Young with 4, just rushing 4. No need to blitz more than that. No need to get, anything too crazy in terms of those different blitz packages and sending more at different times. They felt like, their front is going to get home, and Bryce Young just picked them apart. I mean, you could see him sitting back there pointing guys out. And I think that, again, that exploited what could be considered Georgia's weakest link, which is their secondary. In my opinion, I think that Georgia understands that, and they're going to be sending the house all night long. They saw Ekiyor go out. They saw Chris Owens out. If I'm Dan Lanning, coaching my last game as a member of the Georgia Bulldogs staff, blitz all night. Not to quote Remember the Titans, but that's what I would do. And it really comes down to, can Alabama exploit those rushes where there are going to be times that they're leaving their secondary out on an island on guys against like Ja'Cory Brooks and Jamison Williams? Again, I don't know the answer to that. And I think that depending on how many times, Bama hits one over the top versus, I can tell you one thing, I would be unbelievably surprised if Georgia ends this game with 0 sacks. Again, so talk a little bit about the mentality from Alabama's offensive side of things. For example, you won the game, you won it easily, more or less, that first time around. And I feel like there's a tendency to say, okay, well, we're not going to change anything because a lot of things worked. Talk a little bit about how that can maybe be a detriment, and, kind of your thoughts on what maybe some wrinkles Alabama could throw in this time around to keep the Georgia defense guessing.
Yeah, if this was any other team, you would think, man, I hope they're not overconfident given how easily they won that other game. But because this is Saban, I don't think they're going to have that mentality at all. I think they're pretty dialed in. Pretty vanilla game plan their last time out in Cincinnati, and I'm sure that they're going to have a lot of wrinkles. Bill O'Brien, he's going to work something in to confuse Georgia's defense. As far as like who could be the X factor, it has some surprises. And Brooks on the other side of Williamson, and Latu. I think that those guys are just right when you think you got everybody accounted for. Someone like Latu at tight end or Slade with the slot wide receivers, they could really hurt you. And for Georgia's defense, it didn't obviously come back to haunt them against Michigan, but having the defensive coordinator essentially recruiting for another program on the other side of the continent, I hope things don't come back to haunt them, because I've seen it in the past. Shades of Mark Richt, still coaching in that championship game with one foot out the door. That's hard to pull off, but if they get another performance out of Nakobe Dean, linebacker for Georgia, he played possessed against Michigan. There was times where it looked like he knew the play before they even snapped the ball. That's what it's going to take, man. And they can't finish with 0 sacks. If they dial up the blitzes, I think that he's going to come up with one of those pressures that could change the game.
Yeah, and I think, too, something that's really important from Alabama's side of things is get a lead and make Georgia chase that lead. That's where Stetson Bennett gets in trouble. That's where Stetson Bennett has thrown interceptions in the past and gone out and lost games. I saw an interesting stat. the two games where he's his highest amount of pass attempts, he's both lost them, and they were both against Alabama. One being the regular season game in Tuscaloosa last year, which gives you that a clear blueprint on the more he throws, the more likely he is to make a mistake. I think that should be something that Alabama really tries to do is go out, run a high tempo offense, score early, get a lead, and try to run with that lead to where maybe you can force a mistake or two out of Stetson Bennett. On the flip side, what I saw out of Stetson Bennett against Michigan was mistake-free football. And again, I know we talked about this, earlier, but from Georgia's side of things, establish the run. If you can establish the run with James Cook, Zamir White, McIntosh, if he's not throwing touchdown passes, that sets up the rest of the dynamics for your offense. Obviously, Brock Bowers, God, he's good. And he's a true freshman too, which is insane. And he's a coverage nightmare because can't put a linebacker on him because he's too fast, and you can't put a safety on him because he's bigger. He's just too big. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Alabama plays him and try to limit his game. I will say that kind of opens up some question marks that I've had about Georgia's offense from their outside receiver standpoint, Jermaine Burton being one of them, and George Pickens, obviously being on the other side of that. Now I know he's back. He played against Alabama, had that one big catch, and that was pretty much it. I think he had one catch against Michigan for like 9 yards, and that was pretty much it. So I really think as well, with Alabama's corners being depleted, no Josh Jobe in this game, that could be a really interesting matchup. Chris, not to get too much into it, but tell me a little bit about what you think your X factors are for each team to win this game. If Alabama does X, they will win. If Georgia does X, they will win.
Man, like you mentioned before, you got a blueprint on Stetson Bennett. Get Georgia behind in this game and force them to throw and try to come back against a team like Alabama. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, at what point do those doubts start to creep up from Georgia when they go down in this game? And they've had leads in all these games, and they've somehow just blown it against the Crimson Tide. So I think a combination of maybe a turnover and down a score, that could be just an awful situation for Georgia and Bennett, because we just haven't seen him he's overcome a lot. I mean, the kid's a walk-on. Just to get to this point, transferring back into the program, beating out JT Daniels, that's a lot for a quarterback to accomplish in his career. But going against the mastermind that is Nick Saban, when he's got the blueprint on how to beat you, I just don't see how this goes any differently. I'm not trying to, foreshadow how I'm going to pick this game, but man, it doesn't look rosy from a Georgia standpoint. For Alabama, I think having Robinson back really changes things on what they can do once they do get a lead and sit on it. On the flip side, how they play, the availability of George Pickens, I think, is going to swing a lot of how Georgia does in this game, because you can't double those other players that we've talked about, Bowers, Cook, Burton. He only had one catch, but man, it was a big one. But if Pickens is on the field and he's healthy, that changes everything. And I think it's going to take all hands on deck for Georgia to win this game. So I think those are the players and the plays that for each team to have success. That's what I would pick.
Yeah, and we'll get to our predictions here in just a second, and not to kind of foreshadow that, but in my opinion, this game will be won in the first quarter. And what I mean by that is, in the first couple series, if you see Georgia getting home, if they're getting in Bryce Young's face, something that I saw in the games against LSU and against Auburn is that, and really to some extent against Cincinnati, Bryce tends to get the yips in a way where he starts to feel that pressure and he either rolls in outside of the pocket in the wrong direction, meaning towards more pressure, or he starts to not trust his offensive line and not trust his receivers as much, where, you know, in a game against Georgia the first time around, he was leading those guys. He was trusting his offensive line. But in the games where Alabama's offense has struggled, I do think that it plays a big picture into how Bryce has played, really, because obviously the entire offense flows through him. So I think that in those first couple series, if Georgia's defense can get home, get in Bryce's face, kind of knock down that confidence level just a little bit, this game is on, and it could really, you know, get away from Alabama, I think, especially if Georgia can put up some points in their first couple drives. And on the flip side of that, if they don't get home, if Bryce is free to you know, go out there and sling the rock like he did the last time, and to your point, you know, they get Brian Robinson going and establish a good run game, it could be a really, really long night for the Bulldogs. So I'm gonna send it over to you for your final prediction on this game, and give us kind of your last thoughts here before we adjourn.
Yeah, like I kind of hinted at, I'll believe it when I see it. You know, it's hard to pick against Alabama given the track record between these two teams under Nick Saban and Kirby Smart, and with a couple of games with Stetson Bennett at quarterback. So until proven otherwise, I think that this is Alabama's game to win, and that's what they're going to do. I'll say 28-21, and that's where I'll sit with it.
Alabama Love that. And I think it's interesting that you have Alabama scoring less than 30 points. In my opinion, they need 30 to win. I think that they need to break 30 to win. If they break 30, they will win this game. I am nervous about the injuries. At some point, even if you're Alabama, injuries catch up with you. I mean, there's reasons why the guys are second string and third strings aren't starting, is because there's not as good as the guys that are out there starting, particularly on the offensive line. That worries me a lot. But if Ekiyor can go, if Owens can go, and they're at least, you know, 80-90% of what they were in the SEC championship game, then I don't see any problems there. I think it's going to be really close. I think we're going to see a couple of times Georgia gets home and sacks Bryce Young, and I think there's going to be a couple of plays where Bryce burns them. You know, maybe one or two over the top to Jamison Williams that end up being touchdowns. So that dynamic is really what I'm most interested to see, as well as, like I said earlier, can Georgia establish the run? Because if they can, that sets up all the different pieces of what they want to do on offense. In the end, I'm going to go Alabama 33, Georgia 31 as my final. Chris, before we jump, how can people get a hold of you and kind of continue this conversation on your social media channels? Where can they find you?
Yep. All social media platforms. It's at Nolecore, Nolecore. Hit me up on there, or tune into the Southern Gentleman Sports Show, 100.3 down in Pensacola. Google it. You'll find the link.
Love it. Thanks, Chris, man. This was a lot of fun. And from our side of things, you can follow us on Twitter at the Sportscast1 and visit us on our website at thesportscast.net. Make sure to check out our show schedule throughout the rest of this week and beyond. Again, my name's Nick, and I hope you guys